A hornet the length of a thumb landed on a 5-year-old's sleeve, and nobody in that Amish farmyard moved for a full 3 seconds. Not because they were scared, because moving fast was the one thing that would have gotten the boy stung. What was hanging off the eave of that barn, 30 feet from where the children played every single afternoon, held enough wasps to blacken the sky if it ever came apart at once. By the time the family called it what it was, the nest was the size of a propane tank. This is the story of how one Amish farm, using nothing but tools that were already sitting in the barn, took down a nest that a professional exterminator later said he wouldn't have touched without a bee suit rated for something a lot meaner than European hornets. Let's get into it. It wasn't the first warning. 3 weeks earlier, one of the younger daughters had come in from the coop crying, a welt already rising on her forearm, insisting something had bitten her out of nowhere. Erin checked her over, put a paste of baking soda on the sting, and figured a single hornet had gotten tangled in her sleeve. Nobody connected it to the barn. Stings happen on a working farm in July, same as splinters and sunburn, and one angry insect off on its own doesn't usually mean much. Looking back, Erin would say that sting was the colony's first warning shot, and the family simply didn't know yet what was hanging 30 feet over their heads. On a farm outside a Lancaster County settlement, the kind of place with no power lines running to the house and a diesel generator that only gets switched on to run the milk cooler, a father named Aaron Yoder noticed something wrong with the sound coming off the old hay barn. Not the barn itself, the eave above the hayloft door, where a knot of grey paper had been growing since early summer and nobody had bothered to look twice at it. Wasps build fast when the weather cooperates. A queen starts alone in spring with a nest no bigger than a golf ball. And by the height of summer, if nothing disturbs her and the food supply holds, that colony can be pushing thousands of workers. Entomologists who study bald-faced hornets, which build the football-shaped paper nests most people picture when they hear the word wasp, say a nest that size usually means the colony found an ideal spot and simply never got interrupted. This one hadn't been interrupted in months. There's also a reason this species in particular worries people who work outdoors for a living. Bald-faced hornets aren't especially aggressive when they're out foraging alone, same as most wasps, but provoke the nest itself, even by accident. A stray baseball, a ladder brushing the eave, a child's kite string catching a branch nearby. And the colony doesn't send 1 or 2 defenders, it sends dozens at once, and every one of them can sting more than a single time. Extension entomologists describe it as one of the more organized group defense responses among wasp species in the eastern United States, which is exactly why a nest that size, sitting over a footpath used by 6 children several times a day, wasn't a wait-and-see situation. Aaron's oldest boy was the one who found it, not by sight, but by sound. He'd climbed into the loft to toss down hay bales for the evening milking, and the low hum coming through the wall stopped him before he opened the door. He backed out slow, the way his father had taught him to back away from a spooked horse, and he didn't run until he was clear of the barn. That night, Aaron and 2 of his neighbors walked out to the barn with a lantern and stood underneath the eave from a safe distance. The nest wasn't round anymore. It had swollen into an oblong mass, roughly the size of a large propane tank, and even from 20 feet away they could hear it breathing. That's the only word Aaron's wife used to describe it later. Breathing. A low, constant rustle of thousands of wings inside paper walls. Here's the part that turned this from an inconvenience into an emergency. That barn eave sat directly above the path the children walked every single day, twice a day, to get from the house to the chicken coop. 6 kids in that family, the youngest not yet 3, and bald-faced hornets, unlike honeybees, don't lose their stinger after one use. A single hornet can sting multiple times, and when a nest is disturbed, the whole colony responds together. Wildlife extension officers that field these calls every August say a mature nest like this one can hold anywhere from several hundred to well over 10,000 insects by late summer, depending on the season. And a colony that size defending its home is capable of putting a grown man in the hospital, let alone a toddler. So the wasps had to come down. The question was how? Because an Amish farm doesn't reach for a can of Raid and a 5-gallon respirator the way an English exterminator would. No electricity on the property means no aerosol foggers, no bug zapper trucks, none of the equipment a pest control company drives in with. What that farm had instead was decades of inherited know-how, the kind that gets passed down at barn raisings and quilting bees long before anyone needs it. Plus, a short list of tools that had been sitting in that same barn for years. A coal oil lantern, a long-handled pole with a hook welded to the end for pulling loose boards, burlap feed sacks, a bucket of diesel fuel kept for the tractor, and patience. The plan Aaron and his neighbours settled on is one that's been used on farms for well over a century, long before anyone was spraying chemicals out of a can. You wait for full dark, because bald-faced hornets go quiet and mostly stationary at night, their vision worse than a human's in low light. You work from a distance using a pole, not your hands, and you use fire and smoke carefully to disorient the colony before you ever try to physically remove the nest. Before any of that, though, there was a conversation at the kitchen table that Aaron's wife, Rachel, remembers more clearly than the removal itself. No power tools, no professional sprayers, just 3 men, a pole, and fire, 30 feet from a barn wall. She wasn't against it. She just wanted to know exactly how it would go, step by step, before she let her husband and his brother walk out into the dark towards something that size. Aaron checked the wind that evening the way he'd check it before burning a brush pile. Out of the north, steady, nothing gusting. Good enough. He told the older kids to keep the little ones inside, no matter what they heard, and Rachel kept a lantern lit in the kitchen window the whole time, watching the yard. Around 11 that night, once every light in the house was out except that one kitchen lamp, and the younger kids were long asleep, Aaron and 2 neighbours, a man named Eli Stoltzfus and his brother-in-law, walked back out to the barn. They didn't carry lanterns close to the nest itself, since bright light this near a hive can trigger exactly the defensive swarm they were trying to avoid. Instead, they worked by the faint glow of a covered lantern set 30 feet back, letting their eyes adjust the rest of the way. Eli soaked a burlap sack in diesel and wrapped it around the end of the pole, then held a second sack, dry, ready to smother the nest the moment it dropped. The idea wasn't to burn the nest outright, which risks setting the whole barn eave on fire. It was to use a slow smolder, held just beneath the nest for a few minutes, to push smoke up into the paper structure. Smoke disrupts the pheromones hornets use to coordinate a group attack. The same basic principle beekeepers rely on with their smokers, just scaled up and improvised for a much angrier insect. For nearly 10 minutes, nothing happened except smoke curling up along the barn wall and the hum inside the nest rising and falling. Then the sound changed. Aaron described it afterward as the nest starting to boil, hornets pouring out along the seams faster than the smoke could settle them. That's the moment the whole plan could have fallen apart. If the colony had mounted a real counterattack right then, 3 men with a pole and a burlap sack would have had nowhere to go fast enough. Eli didn't back off. He held the pole steady, his brother-in-law crouched low behind him, second sack ready, breathing through a bandana tied over his nose and mouth against the diesel fumes. nobody spoke. Instead, disoriented and half smothered, most of the hornets clustered on the outside of the nest rather than launching into the air. Eli used the hook end of the pole to pry the nest free from the eave in one motion, while his brother-in-law smothered it in the second sack the instant it dropped, cinching the bag shut around a mass of paper and insects that, by any rough count, numbered somewhere in the low thousands still clinging to it, with thousands more scattered in the grass and against the barn wall. They carried the sealed sack well clear of the house, out past the far fence line, and left it there until morning. Cold overnight temperatures did what the smoke had started, and by sunrise, the colony was finished. Inside, Rachel had watched the whole thing from the kitchen window without moving, one hand on the sill, not breathing right until she saw all three men walking back toward the house at once. She didn't ask how it went. She just counted heads. 3 out, 3 back. That was the only answer she needed that night. Nobody got stung that night. Not once. Aaron said afterward that the closest call was his own hand brushing the barn wall on the walk back, not the nest itself. The next morning, in the daylight, is when the family got a real look at what had been 30 feet over their children's heads all summer. Peeling back the outer paper layers, they found comb stacked in dense horizontal tiers, cell after cell, the structure of a colony that pest professionals say typically takes an entire season to build to that scale. Local extension agents, who later heard the story, put the size in the same range that qualifies as one of the larger bald-faced hornet nests reported in that part of the state that year, though nobody weighed or formally counted the colony, so the exact number stays an estimate rather than a documented fact. What strikes people about a story like this isn't just the size of the nest. It's the gap between what most of us would do and what this family did instead. Most people, English or Amish, see a wasp nest and either call someone or drive to the hardware store for a can of spray foam that shoots 20 feet. This family didn't have that option, and more than that, they didn't seem to want it. The tools were already in the barn. The knowledge was already in Aaron's memory, taught to him the same way it had been taught to his father. There was no video to watch, no forum to search. Just a problem 30 feet from where his kids played, and a method that's been quietly working on farms like this since long before pest control was an industry. It would be easy to romanticize that. It would also be dishonest to pretend there wasn't real risk in it. A single miscalculated gust of wind that night could have carried smoke away from the nest instead of into it. A dropped sack, a slip on wet grass, a hornet that didn't cluster the way the rest did. The margin between a quiet, successful removal and a genuine emergency was thinner than anyone standing in that yard wanted to admit out loud. Word travels fast in a settlement that size, and by the following church Sunday, half the men in the district had heard some version of the story. A few had done it themselves at one point or another, usually on a smaller nest, and swapped notes on the same basic method. Full dark, a pole instead of a hand, smoke before you ever touch the thing. One older neighbor, a beekeeper by trade, told Aaron he'd have used a slower smolder and given it closer to 20 minutes rather than 10, since a nest that large can hold heat and therefore hold defenders longer than a smaller one. Nobody treated what Aaron's family did as reckless. They treated it as the kind of job that gets done on a farm because it has to, the same way a downed fence or a sick calf gets handled without waiting for someone else to show up. By the following afternoon, the barn eave was just an eave again, a pale outline on the wood, the only sign anything had ever hung there. The kids were back on the path to the coop within a day, walking underneath the exact spot where, 48 hours earlier, a nest holding thousands of hornets had been quietly growing all summer without a single person noticing until the sound gave it away. There's a way of life that shows up in a story like this without anyone ever having to say it out loud. No emergency line to call, no warranty on the outcome, just a family, a problem on their own land, and the assumption that they were the ones responsible for solving it. Rachel put it simply afterward. On an English farm, she said, you dial a number and wait for a truck. On theirs, you were the truck. Was it worth the risk those 3 men took, walking out into the dark with nothing but a pole and a bag of diesel-soaked burlap, when a phone call and a check to a pest control company would have handled it just as well? Aaron never really answered that question the same way twice, but every night since, before the lanterns go out, somebody in that family walks the barn eaves first, just to listen.